We used to steal our peace in the smallest ways. On warm afternoons, when the pastor was away on his visits and the children were finally asleep, Sister Rebecca and I would sit on the back porch steps where the trees hid us from the road. Between us sat a dented metal bowl, cool against our legs, slowly filling with peas we shelled in a soft, steady rhythm. Plink, plink, plink. That sound became our secret language. Not words, not rebellion, just proof that we were still human. In those quiet minutes, the tightness would loosen from Rebecca's face. The lines carved there by years of silence would fade, and I would catch a glimpse of the girl she must have been before this house swallowed her whole. She'd tell me about books she once loved, about poetry she used to read by a window that let in real sunlight. She spoke of a dream of becoming a schoolteacher, her voice going soft and far away, like she was visiting another lifetime. I never told her, but when she spoke, I saw my own lost self reflected back at me. We never talked about running. We never said the word escape. That would have been too dangerous, like lighting a match in a room full of gas. Instead, we shared memories the way prisoners share stories about the sky, quietly, carefully, just enough to remember what freedom once felt like. But in a town like Bamberg, silence is louder than shouting. At church gatherings, I began to notice the looks. Women who once pitied me, the young spiritual wife, now watched us both with narrow eyes. Their whispers drifted like smoke. She spends too much time with Rebecca. It's not proper. She forgets her place. They didn't see comfort. They saw defiance. And of course, he heard. Looking back now, I'm sure he was the one conducting the whispers like a choir. One evening, he called us into his office. That room always felt colder than the rest of the house, even in summer. The air smelled of lemon polish and old paper, clean, sharp, suffocating. Colored light from the stained glass window fell across his desk, painting him in holy reds and blues, like some kind of living icon. He didn't look angry. He looked disappointed. That was worse. He folded his large hands over his Bible. "Ladies," he began, voice heavy with false sorrow, "there have been concerns. Such a gentle word for a cage being built." He turned to Rebecca first. "People say you seem troubled, burdened in spirit. Your closeness with Celestine is confusing the congregation." Then his eyes landed on me, cold as river stones. "And you," he said softly, "your role here is one of humility. Familiarity with my wife makes people question the sacred order. It makes me appear weak." There it was. Not sin, not wrongdoing. His image. He leaned forward, voice lowering into that smooth tone that could twist guilt into obedience. "This is a test from the Lord. Satan uses gossip to sow discord. The answer is piety. Distance. Your friendship, though well-meant, has become a stumbling block for others' faith." He used God like a weapon and handed it to us to aim at ourselves. We walked out without looking at each other. We couldn't. The message was clear. The porch steps, the peas, the quiet memories finished. We were to become strangers again, ghosts moving through the same house. That night, I learned something terrible. The cruelest cages aren't made of iron. They're built from other people's prayers. The silence that followed was heavier than before. Now I knew Rebecca was only steps away and still unreachable. I felt myself starting to fray inside, like cloth worn thin. When I looked in the mirror, my eyes looked older, haunted. I was afraid of disappearing the way she had. Then, one Saturday, something unexpected happened. The pastor and Rebecca were to attend an overnight church conference. It would be the first time I'd be alone in the parsonage since arriving. Before leaving, he handed me a list of chores. At the very top, written neatly in his hand, thoroughly dust and organize my office. My stomach dropped. His office, the place where my life had been rewritten. Fear washed through me, but beneath it, something else stirred. Curiosity, desperate, dangerous. For years, I had been a character in his story. For one day, I wanted to see the author's notes. The silence after the pastor's warning did more damage than his words ever could. Sister Rebecca and I moved through the house like shadows trained not to touch. The back porch steps stayed empty. The metal bowl for shelling peas sat upside down near the sink, unused, like a memory turned to the wall. If our hands brushed while passing a dish, we both jerked back as if burned, not because we believed his sermon about holy distance, but because we knew he was watching even when he wasn't in the room. Loneliness hits harder when hope once sat beside you. I had known isolation before, but this was different. Now I knew there was another soul inside the same prison who understood the bars, and I still couldn't reach her. That knowledge hollowed me out. Days became colorless, scrubbing, cooking, folding, tending to children who deserved a mother with light in her eyes, not a woman slowly dissolving. I began to fear something worse than his control. I feared disappearing. Sometimes I'd pause in front of the small bathroom mirror and stare too long. The girl I used to be, the one who laughed too loudly, who believed in love and Sunday picnics and the future, she was fading. In her place stood a quiet woman with careful movements and eyes that never fully rested. Sister Rebecca had once been that girl too. I saw it in the way she sometimes paused mid-task, like her mind had wandered somewhere warmer. I was terrified of becoming her ghost while still alive. Then came the opportunity. It arrived disguised as routine. A regional church conference in Colombia. Overnight. The pastor and Sister Rebecca both had to attend. I would stay behind with the children. Alone. The word echoed in my chest like a church bell. Before leaving, he handed me a list of chores written in his firm, slanted handwriting. Sweep, wash linens, prepare Sunday lesson materials, and at the top, thoroughly dust and organize my office. My stomach dropped. room was his throne room, the place where scripture turned into shackles, where my parents had been convinced this was God's calling, where my own voice had slowly been erased. But beneath the fear, something else rose. Curiosity, desperate, dangerous. For years, I had been the story he told. Maybe, for once, I could read the margins. After they left, the house felt unnatural, too quiet. No heavy footsteps, no sermons drifting through walls. Even the air felt thinner. I fed the children, laid them down for naps, then stood outside his office door, my heart beating so loudly I thought it might wake the dead. I went in. The smell hit first, lemon polish and old paper. His scent, authority and rot dressed as holiness. I started with the shelves, dusting slowly, pretending my hands weren't shaking. Papers stacked perfectly, pens aligned, everything controlled. Just like us, my eyes kept sliding to the desk. I opened the top drawer. Church bulletins, stationery, nothing. Second drawer, more of the same. Then the middle drawer, locked. The small click of the handle not turning felt louder than a scream. A locked drawer in a house where nothing belonged to us. I scanned the room, breath shallow. That's when I saw it. A small brass key sitting in a dish with coins and paper clips on the bookshelf. He had grown careless or arrogant. My hand moved before my courage could fade. I grabbed the key, slid it into the lock. The click when it turned felt like crossing a line drawn by God himself. Inside were only two things: a worn Bible and a small black leather ledger. No letters, no money, no obvious sin, just paper. I reached for the ledger first. The first page had a title in his thin, spider-like handwriting: The Lord's Special Servants. Below it, names, women's names, and dates. Marianne Peters, 1948. Elizabeth Grace Collier, 1951. Sarah Ellen Foster, 1953. My breath left my body. Next to each name were short notes. Family relocated, mission complete. Sent to serve in Tennessee ministry, obedient. Lost in childbirth, the Lord's will. I flipped the page. Celestine Brooks, 1957, quiet spirit. Very promising. Parents cooperative. I wasn't chosen. I was processed. A project. A line item. My hands went numb as I opened the Bible. The verses he had used to trap my parents were marked, underlined, highlighted, but the margins in the margins were notes. Effective for countering jealousy. Use with parents emphasizes divine precedent. It wasn't faith. It was a manual, a system, a cold, rehearsed script for breaking girls and calling it God's will. Something inside me shifted then. The fear didn't vanish. It hardened. I carefully put everything back, locked the drawer, returned the key, wiped the handle, but I was not the same woman who had walked in. I had gone looking for understanding. I had found proof, and proof changes everything. After that day, I I stopped being a frightened girl trying to survive God's will. I became a woman studying her enemy. The house hadn't changed. The pastor still bowed his head the same way at dinner. His voice still flowed like honey over scripture. The church bells still rang on Sundays, but the illusion was gone. Every gesture of his now looked rehearsed. Every soft smile calculated. I watched him the way a mouse watches a cat that's pretending to nap. And I saw everything. The way he touched people's shoulders, always just a second too long. The way conversations bent back toward him, like iron filings pulled by a magnet. The way his eyes sometimes went empty in the middle of prayer, like a man reading instructions only he could see. I also watched Sister Rebecca. Now I understood her. The stillness wasn't peace. It was containment. I noticed how she held her breath when he entered a room, how she flinched, just slightly, when his chair scraped back from the table, how she steered conversations away from anything emotional, anything personal, anything that might trigger one of his teachings. We were two animals who had learned where the traps were. The urge to tell her about the ledger burned in my throat like acid. But the wall between us was still standing. If he suspected even a whisper of alliance, he wouldn't punish me. He would punish her. So I carried the knowledge alone. Fear became routine, like brushing teeth, like folding laundry, a daily ritual you don't even notice anymore. But underneath it, something else had taken root. Purpose. About a month later, the tension in the house felt thicker. Sister Rebecca moved like someone underwater. One afternoon, she asked me to help clear out the old storage closet at the top of the stairs, a place filled with church leftovers and forgotten things. The air up there smelled like dust and mothballs, boxes of Christmas decorations, old choir robes, stacks of dried palm fronds. I reached behind a heavy box and my fingers brushed something wooden. A small pine box, plain, personal. I don't know why I pulled it out. Instinct, maybe. I opened it. Inside were small, sad things. A tarnished locket. A dried flower that crumbled when I touched it. And a thin children's primer, the kind used to teach the alphabet. When I lifted it, a folded paper slipped out. My heart began to pound so loudly I thought Rebecca would hear it. I opened the letter. Dearest Clara, my blood turned to ice. The handwriting was young, careful, hopeful. She wrote about being lonely, missing her sister. She wrote about the pastor, about his nightly prayers. And then, he thinks I am foolish, but I watch him. He keeps a little black book in his desk. He writes our names. If anything happens to me, tell someone. Please tell them to look for the book. Signed, Sarah Ellen, the name from the ledger. She hadn't been silent. She had tried to speak. No one had listened. The room tilted. The air felt too thin. That letter wasn't just paper. It was a voice from the grave handing me a responsibility. My fear changed shape in that moment. It stopped being wild and helpless. It became sharp. focused. This wasn't only about me escaping anymore. This was testimony, evidence. A chain of girls erased and explained away with words like mission and God's will. I folded the letter and hid it. That night, after everyone slept, I sewed it into the hem of my plainest dress, along with the few dollars I'd secretly saved over the years. Each stitch felt like armor being built. I didn't know when, I didn't know how, but I knew this: I would not die in that house. Time passed. I waited, watching, listening, performing obedience like a role in a play. Then came the Sunday that changed everything. The church was full. Autumn leaves clung to coats. The sermon was loud and righteous, full of fire and divine plans. Then the pastor stopped mid-sermon, face glowing with fake revelation. "God has blessed us again," he announced. My body went cold before my mind understood. Another pure vessel has been chosen. And then he said her name, Linda Sue Patterson, 15 years old, freckles, soft voice in the youth choir. I looked across the church and found her. Her parents were crying with pride. Linda Sue looked like I had looked years ago, confused, terrified, trapped in honor. In that moment, something inside me broke open. Not fear, rage, hot, clean, certain. I saw the cycle starting again. Another name about to be written in that black ledger. Another girl to be told God had chosen her suffering. And suddenly, my waiting ended. This was no longer survival. This was war. I wasn't just running for myself anymore. I was running to stop the next line in his book. The decision didn't feel dramatic. It felt inevitable, like something that had been moving toward me for years and had finally arrived at my doorstep, breathing hard, saying, "It's time." That night, the house buzzed with a strange energy. The pastor was almost cheerful, accepting quiet congratulations from the deacons who stopped by after the service. Words like blessing and divine favor floated through the air like poison perfume. Sister Rebecca moved among them like a ghost pouring coffee. I watched Linda Sue's future being celebrated in my living room. I said nothing. I smiled when required, nodded, served plates, played my part so perfectly that not even he looked twice at me. But inside, everything had shifted into motion. After the last guest left and the house settled, I began preparing. Not in a rush, not in panic. Panic makes noise. I bathed the children slowly, memorizing the shape of their faces, the softness of their hair. Samuel asked why I was being extra nice. I kissed his forehead and told him I just loved him. It wasn't a lie. It just wasn't the whole truth. I laid out their warmest clothes. I waited. The house went dark. The pastor's bedroom door closed. Floorboards creaked once. Then silence. Then the slow, heavy rhythm of his snoring. I stood in the kitchen, heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my fingertips. I retrieved the mason jar from behind the flour sack. Coins and folded bills I had skimmed from housekeeping money over years, one at a time. My hands shook as I tucked it into a cloth bag. Then I put on the dress with Sarah Ellen's letter sewn into the hem. Armor. I went to the children's room, woke them gently. No lights, just whispers. Adventure, I told them. They were too sleepy to question. I carried Lee. The boys held my skirt. We moved through the hallway like burglars in our own lives. At the back door, I stopped. Inside that house was everything I knew. Pain, fear, routine. Outside was everything I didn't. But outside had air. I turned the knob. The click sounded like thunder in my ears. I froze, waiting for a voice to shout my name. Nothing. Cold night air rushed in, sharp and alive. It smelled like damp earth, and something else I hadn't breathed in years. Possibility. We stepped into the dark. Every crunch of gravel felt like a gunshot. I kept expecting lights to flash on behind us, for his voice to boom across the yard, for a hand to grab my shoulder. But the house stayed silent. We walked through Bamberg like ghosts. The oak tree in the square looked like a gallows. The church steeple pointed at the sky like an accusation. Every house felt like it had eyes. My children began to shiver. I pulled them closer, whispering promises I had no proof I could keep. The crossroads came into view, a lonely bench under a flickering street lamp, where long-distance buses sometimes stopped. We huddled together. I checked the crumpled money. Not enough. The first bus wasn't due until dawn. Hours. Panic clawed up my throat. He would wake. He would notice. He would know exactly where we'd go. I had led my children out of a cage into open wilderness with wolves. Tears froze on my cheeks. Then headlights appeared in the distance. My blood turned to ice. The car slowed. Light washed over us. I squeezed my eyes shut, bracing for his voice. A door opened. Celestine. I opened my eyes. Sister Rebecca stood there, pale as moonlight, shaking. For a moment, I thought she'd come to drag me back. But her eyes were full of something I'd never seen there before. Defiance. I heard the floorboard, she whispered. I knew. She pressed a thick envelope into my hand. It was heavy, my mother's inheritance. He never knew. Go to Charleston, big enough to disappear. I couldn't speak. I can't come, she said, voice breaking. He'd find me, but I won't let him have you. The sound of a distant engine rumbled. The bus. Go, she urged, squeezing my arm. Then she was gone, swallowed by the night. The bus pulled up, hissing. I gathered the children and climbed aboard, paid the driver, collapsed into a seat as Bamberg's lights faded behind us. A strange quiet filled my chest. We were free, but freedom didn't feel like victory. It felt like stepping onto a battlefield I couldn't yet see. The bus smelled like diesel, worn fabric, and sleep. I sank into the cracked vinyl seat, Lee heavy in my arms, the boys curled against my sides. My body trembled now that we were still. Fear had carried me forward. Stillness let it catch up. Through the window, Bamberg shrank into darkness. One last streetlight blinked past, then fields swallowed everything. I kept waiting to hear a car racing behind us, to see headlights gaining, to feel a hand clamp down on my shoulder. Nothing came. The driver didn't look at me twice. Just another tired woman with children traveling before dawn. The ordinariness of it almost broke me. After years of living inside a nightmare, the world outside didn't know, didn't care. The road stretched on like any other morning, but inside my chest, a war drum beat. I slipped my hand into the envelope Rebecca had given me. Bills, more than I had ever held at one time. Enough for a ticket, maybe a room, maybe food. Hope felt fragile, like glass in my pocket. The sky began to lighten, pale gray spreading across the horizon. Samuel stirred. "Where are we going?" he mumbled. "Somewhere new," I whispered. "Is Daddy coming?" The question pierced deeper than any knife. "No," I said softly. "It's just us now." He nodded sleepily, trusting me completely. That trust was heavier than any chain. When the bus finally pulled into Charleston, the city felt enormous. Loud, alive, people everywhere, moving fast, carrying bags, shouting, laughing. No one knew my name. No one knew his. I stepped off the bus with 4 children and 1 small bag. Freedom had never looked so terrifying. The first days blurred. A women's shelter took us in after I told just enough of the story. Not everything. The whole truth still felt like fire in my mouth. But they saw enough in my eyes to believe me. The room they gave us was small but clean. A bunk bed, a crib, a window that looked out over a parking lot. It was the most beautiful room I had ever seen. The children slept without whispering. No footsteps pacing outside the door. No sermons drifting through walls. No fear of being watched. I didn't sleep at all. Every sound jolted me awake. Every car door slam made my heart race. Freedom takes time to trust. I found work scrubbing floors in an office building at night while volunteers watched the children. My hands cracked. My back ached, but the pain belonged to me. It wasn't tied to obedience or punishment. It was honest. Months passed. My belly grew heavier. This child would be born outside his shadow. That thought alone carried me through exhaustion. Still, fear followed like a shadow at noon. What if he found us? What if he came with police and lies and scripture? He knew how to twist the world. One evening at the shelter, a counselor sat beside me while the children played. "You don't have to keep carrying this alone," she said gently. I almost laughed. I had been carrying it alone my entire life. But that night, I told her about the ledger, about the names, about Sarah Ellen's letter sewn into my dress. The counselor went very still. "That's evidence," she whispered. The word felt strange, heavy, powerful. Evidence meant truth that couldn't be prayed away. They helped me make copies of the letter, store one safely, send one to someone who knew how to handle such things. I didn't understand the system yet, but I understood this. The secret was no longer buried only inside me. When my daughter was born, I named her Hope. Holding her, I cried harder than I had the night we escaped. Because for the first time, I wasn't welcoming a child into fear. I was welcoming her into possibility. Life in Charleston wasn't easy. The apartment I eventually rented was tiny. I worked 2 jobs. We ate simple meals. The children wore second-hand clothes, but laughter returned. Real laughter. Loud and messy and free. Sometimes I would watch them playing in the park and feel something unfamiliar spreading through me. Peace. Not the forced, silent peace of submission, but the noisy, imperfect peace of safety. Still, in quiet moments, I felt the past breathing down my neck. The ledger. The girls whose names filled those pages. Linda Sue. I had escaped, but the story wasn't finished. Somewhere in Bamberg, he was still preaching, and monsters don't stop hunting just because one victim gets away. Charleston taught me how to breathe again, but it didn't teach me how to forget. The past lived in small things. A certain Bible verse, overheard in passing, could make my stomach knot. The smell of lemon cleaner in the office building where I worked sometimes pulled me straight back into his study, my hands trembling over that locked drawer. Trauma doesn't knock when it returns. It just sits beside you like it never left. Still, life moved forward. Hope was a quiet baby, watchful, as if she had arrived already understanding the world required caution. The boys started school. The first time I watched them run through a playground without glancing over their shoulders, I had to sit down because my legs gave out. Freedom is beautiful, but when you've never known it, it can feel unreal, like you might wake up back in the parsonage at any moment. I kept my head down, worked, saved, avoided churches. Faith had become complicated. I still prayed, but not in buildings with pulpits. I prayed while folding laundry, while walking to work, while watching my children sleep. I spoke to a God I hoped was different from the one he had sold us. Years passed quietly, almost peacefully. Then the letter came. It arrived at the shelter's old forwarding address, finally finding me after being passed through hands that didn't know its weight. The envelope was thin, the handwriting unfamiliar. My hands shook before I even opened it. Something deep inside me had always known this silence wouldn't last forever. The letter was from a woman named Clara, Sarah Ellen's sister. I had to sit down before I could finish the first paragraph. She wrote that my disappearance had not been contained the way he must have hoped. A young, spiritual wife, vanishing with 4 children, was too large a crack to plaster over with sermons. The letter I had left behind, the one Rebecca delivered, had reached someone with doubts already growing. Whispers changed direction. Dorothy May, the elderly cleaning woman, finally spoke. She gave names, dates, stories she had swallowed for years. Another woman who had been sent away came back to town and told the truth about why she'd been forced to leave. Each voice made the next one braver. And then came Linda Sue. Her parents, hearing the rumors and seeing my empty room, panicked. They pulled her out before he could isolate her fully. They went to the state police. An investigation began. I stopped breathing as I read. They searched the church, the parsonage, his office, his desk. They found the ledger, the little black book that had haunted my dreams. Clara wrote that the trial tore Bamberg in half. Some defended him to the end. Others wept in court as story after story came out. The notes in the Bible margins, the pattern, the manipulation dressed as scripture. He was convicted. Life in prison. I read that line over and over until the words blurred. The monster had bars now. I slid down the kitchen wall and cried, not the sharp, panicked tears of fear, but something deeper, something like release. For years, I had carried the ghosts of those girls, afraid their stories would vanish like smoke. They hadn't. They had become truth. Clara wrote that Sister Rebecca left town the day after sentencing, sold the parsonage, donated the money, disappeared. No one knew where she went. I hoped she found a place where silence meant peace, not fear. Linda Sue, she said, went to college, became a teacher. I pressed the letter to my chest and laughed through tears. The cycle had snapped. The next name hadn't been written. That night, I gathered my children, old enough now to understand more than fairy tales, and I told them the whole story, not gently, not in pieces. Truth deserves light. They cried. They held me. And not one of them looked at me with shame. Only pride. For the first time, the past didn't feel like a shadow chasing me. It felt like ground I had crossed. The war I hadn't known how to name all those years finally had an ending. But survival had changed me. I wasn't just a woman who escaped anymore. I was a witness. And witnesses don't stay silent. Justice didn't arrive like thunder. It arrived quietly, like a door closing somewhere far behind me. After Clara's letter, something inside me settled for the first time in decades. The constant hum of dread, the one that had lived under my skin since I was a girl, lowered to a whisper. Not gone. Trauma never fully leaves, but quieter. Life in Charleston kept moving, and this time I moved with it instead of running from it. The children grew fast, like children do when fear isn't trimming their wings. Samuel became thoughtful and steady, always watching out for the others. David had laughter that filled whole rooms. Lee, my quiet shadow, turned into a girl with fierce opinions and a heart too big for her small body. And Hope, sweet, solemn Hope, grew up knowing safety as her normal, not her miracle. I worked hard. Too hard, maybe, cleaning offices, washing dishes, taking sewing work at night. My hands aged before the rest of me. But each bill I paid, each meal I placed on the table, felt like a brick in a new foundation. One evening, Years after the trial, I was invited to speak at the shelter where we'd first stayed. They wanted survivors to share their stories with new arrivals, women with the same haunted eyes I used to see in the mirror. I almost said no. Telling the story meant reopening rooms in my memory I had boarded shut. But then I thought of Sarah Ellen's letter, of her begging someone, anyone, to speak if she couldn't. So I stood in a small common room with flickering fluorescent lights and told the truth. My voice shook at first, but as I spoke, something unexpected happened. The women didn't look at me with pity. They looked at me like a map. Afterward, one young mother clutched my hands and whispered, "I thought I was the only one." That sentence changed me more than the trial ever could. I began volunteering, just a few hours at first, sitting with women, filling out forms, watching children so mothers could rest, explaining that manipulation doesn't always look like bruises, that sometimes it wears a smile and carries a Bible. I learned to name what had happened to me: grooming, coercive control, spiritual abuse. Words are powerful. They turn confusion into clarity, shame into responsibility where it belongs, with the abuser. My faith slowly found a new shape. I still couldn't sit in pews comfortably, but I began to believe again in a God who stood with the broken, not the ones breaking them. A quiet God, one who didn't shout. The children knew my story fully by then. We spoke about it openly, without whispers. I wanted them armored with truth, not wounded by secrets. "Are we bad because of him?" David once asked. I knelt in front of him, holding his face. "You are not made from his darkness," I said. "You are made from my courage." I believed it. Time did what time always does. It carried us forward, whether we were ready or not. The children left for college one by one. The apartment grew quieter. I stayed in Charleston, in a small place filled with second-hand furniture and sunlight. Sometimes, in the late afternoons, I would sit by the window and think about the girl I used to be in Bamberg, the one shelling peas on the porch, pretending small moments of peace were enough. I wished I could reach back through time and tell her three things. You are not crazy. You are not chosen by God. And one day, you will walk out. I never saw Sister Rebecca again. But sometimes, when the wind rustles leaves just right, I imagine her somewhere warm, somewhere nameless, finally breathing without permission. The past didn't disappear, but it stopped being a prison. It became a testimony. And testimonies, when spoken out loud, have a way of setting other people free. I used to believe survival was the finish line. It isn't. Survival is just the moment you crawl out of the wreckage and realize you still have to learn how to live. After the children left home, the silence in my apartment felt different than the silence of my past. This one wasn't heavy with fear. It was wide, almost unfamiliar. For years, every decision I made had been about protection. What school district was safest? Which streets to avoid? which neighbors felt trustworthy. My life had been a fortress. Now, there were no small shoes by the door, no late-night coughs to check on, no homework spread across the kitchen table. For the first time, my life wasn't about running or shielding. It was just mine. That realization scared me more than the escape ever had. Who was I without crisis? I filled the quiet with work at first. The shelter had become more than volunteering. It was purpose, stitched into my days. I helped design orientation sessions for new arrivals. We talked about warning signs, about financial independence, about how abusers isolate before they control. I watched women come in hunched and leave standing a little straighter. One afternoon, a counselor pulled me aside. "You're good at this," she said. "Have you ever thought about formal training?" The idea felt absurd. Me, a woman who once believed she deserved suffering. College had never been part of my story. Survival had been my degree, but the thought stayed. I enrolled in evening classes at the community college, just one at first, Introduction to Social Work. I sat in the back, older than most of the students, my notebook filled with careful handwriting. The textbooks gave language to things I had lived, but never understood. Trauma bonding, dissociation, learned helplessness. Each term felt like reclaiming territory from my past. My children cheered me on like I had once cheered at their school plays. "You're literally becoming a superhero, Mom," Lee laughed over the phone. I didn't feel like one. I still startled at sudden noises. Still had nights where memories crept in like uninvited guests. Healing isn't a straight road, it's a spiral. You revisit the same pain, but each time from a higher place. During my second year of classes, something happened I didn't expect. I got a letter. No return address. Just my name written carefully on the front. My hands trembled opening it, old reflexes waking up, but the handwriting inside was unfamiliar. It was from a woman named Ruth. She had grown up in the same religious community I escaped. Different town, same structure, same teachings. She had heard about the trial years ago, then later about my work through a network of survivor advocates. I didn't know it was possible to leave and still believe in God, she wrote. Your story gave me permission to try. I sat at my kitchen table and cried, not from pain, but from something gentler, a feeling like sunlight reaching a place that had always been cold. For so long, my story had felt like something done to me. Now it was something being used. That didn't erase what happened. It didn't excuse it, but it transformed the shape of it. Suffering that ends with you is tragedy. Suffering that lights a path for someone else becomes something else, something almost sacred. I began speaking beyond the shelter, churches, community centers, small conferences. I was always nervous, my palms always damp, but every time someone would wait afterward, eyes shining with that same sentence. I thought I was the only one. The past still visited me though. Trauma is patient. It waits for quiet moments. Sometimes I'd wake before dawn, heart racing, the old house in Bamberg vivid in my mind. On those mornings, I didn't fight the memories anymore. I'd sit with them. "I see you," I'd whisper to the frightened girl I had been. "But we're safe now." And for the first time in my life, that was true not just physically, but inside my own mind. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was building a life that had room for joy without guilt, room for rest without fear, room for a future that wasn't shaped like my past. And just when I began to believe the story was settling into something like peace, the past knocked one more time. The knock came on a Tuesday afternoon. I almost didn't answer. I had just returned from class, my bag still on my shoulder, mind crowded with case studies and deadlines. The knock wasn't loud, but it carried a weight that made my chest tighten in a way I hadn't felt in years. Slow, careful, official. Through the peephole, I saw a woman in a navy blazer and a man holding a folder. For a split second, I was back in that courtroom hallway decades ago, fluorescent lights buzzing, my hands shaking. Trauma doesn't ask permission before it time travels. I opened the door anyway. "Mrs. Harper?" the woman asked gently. A name I had chosen for myself, a name no one from my past had ever spoken. "Yes, my name is Detective Laura Mendes. This is Investigator Cole. We're reopening a series of historical abuse cases connected to a religious network operating across state lines in the 70s and 80s. The world didn't spin. It stilled, like the air before a storm. We believe your case may be connected to others we've recently uncovered," she continued. "Your testimony years ago helped, but we now have survivors who were children at the time. Some of them never identified before. Children, my breath left me in a thin line. Even after everything, even after prison, even after years of silence, the damage had stretched further than I knew. They didn't ask me to relive details immediately. They asked for permission, for consent. Words I never heard when I was young. I invited them in. We sat at my small kitchen table, sunlight slanting across old wood, the hum of the refrigerator filling pauses. They explained carefully, records lost, institutions that had protected themselves, victims who had only now found language for what happened. "And Sister Rebecca?" I asked before I could stop myself. The detective's eyes softened. "We believe she may have helped others leave, the way she helped you. Her name appears in multiple survivor accounts as someone who quietly intervened." A breath I'd been holding for 40 years finally escaped. She hadn't just saved me. She had been fighting a quiet war. When they left, they asked if I'd be willing to give an updated statement. There could be new charges, broader accountability, institutional cover-ups finally coming to light. I said yes, not because I wanted revenge, because silence protects the wrong people. That night, sleep didn't come easily. Memories moved through me like weather, not overwhelming, but present. I made tea and sat by the window, watching streetlights flicker on. I thought about Sarah Ellen, about Clara, about all the girls whose names I'd never known. Pain shared across decades, across states, across lives that never intersected, except through harm, but also through survival. The next weeks were heavy. Interviews, old photographs, documents. Each piece of evidence was a reminder. This wasn't just my story. It was a pattern, a system, a structure that had counted on obedience and shame. This time, though, I wasn't a frightened girl on a porch. I was a woman with language, support, and a life that existed beyond the trauma. At one point, during a long session, the investigator paused. "You can stop anytime," he said. "We don't want to re-traumatize you." I surprised myself by answering calmly. Telling the truth isn't what traumatized me. The silence did. The hearings didn't make headlines like big cases do. No cameras, no crowds, but outcomes came quietly. Organizations investigated, funding cut, names documented in public record. History, at last, written more honestly. One afternoon, I received another letter. This one from a young woman named Elise. She had been 6 years old when the group moved through her town. She had testified, too. "I was scared," she wrote. "But knowing someone had stood up before me made it possible." I held that letter the way you hold something fragile and sacred. We are never as alone as our abusers want us to believe. The process stirred grief, yes, anger too, but beneath it was something steady and unexpected. Pride, not in what happened, never that, but in who I had become after. The frightened girl from Bamberg had once believed obedience was the same as goodness. Now I knew better. Goodness sometimes looks like refusal, like walking out, like speaking, like answering a knock on the door when every instinct says hide, because you know your voice might help unlock someone else's cage. And still, even after all of that, one final truth waited for me, one I would only understand when I returned to where it all began. I didn't plan to go back. For years, Bamberg existed only as a ghost in my memory, a place wrapped in heat and silence, where cicadas screamed and little girls learned to mistake fear for faith. I had built an entire life without looking over my shoulder. But healing has a strange way of circling back to beginnings. It was Samuel who suggested it first. "Maybe seeing it now," he said gently over coffee one visit, "might feel different." I didn't answer right away, yet months later, I found myself driving down a narrow South Carolina road, pine trees leaning overhead like they were whispering secrets to each other. My hands were steady on the wheel. My heart wasn't racing. That was new. Bamberg hadn't changed much. Same sleepy streets, same brick storefronts with faded signs. Time had passed over it, but not through it. I parked a block away from the old house. I didn't go to the door. I didn't need to. From the sidewalk, I could see the porch where I used to shell peas into a tin bowl, pretending small tasks were enough to quiet big fears. The paint was different now, the steps repaired, but the air around it still felt heavy with memory. I expected panic. Instead, I felt something like distance. That girl survived, I thought. She doesn't live here anymore. I walked instead to the edge of town, where an old dirt path led toward a field that once felt like the edge of the world. As a child, I'd stand there at dusk and wonder what life looked like beyond the horizon. Now I knew. It looked like late-night homework at a kitchen table, like children laughing in safe bedrooms, like women finding their voices in shelter meeting rooms, like letters from strangers saying, "You helped me leave." The wind moved through tall grass, soft and constant. I closed my eyes and let it brush past me. "I made it," I whispered, not to God, not to the past, but to the girl I had been. And for the first time, the memory of that girl didn't fill me with sorrow. It filled me with respect. On my way back to Charleston, I stopped at a small church, not the kind I grew up in. No heavy curtains, no locked doors, just sunlight through plain windows and the quiet creak of wooden pews. I didn't kneel. I just sat. Faith, for me, no longer meant obedience. It meant choosing light over silence, truth over comfort, protection over image. If God existed, I believed he lived in the shelter common rooms, in courtroom courage, in the steady hands of social workers, in the quiet bravery of women packing bags in the middle of the night. Not in fear, never again in fear. Years later, when my hair had silvered and my hands bore the map of time, I would still wake some mornings with echoes of the past. Trauma doesn't erase, it softens at the edges, but those echoes no longer ruled me. They reminded me of how far a person can travel without moving states, of how a voice once silenced can become a bridge for others, of how survival, when nurtured, grows into purpose. At a conference one spring, a young woman approached me after I spoke. She looked barely 20. "I don't know who I am without what happened to me," she said. I held her hands the way someone once held mine. "You get to decide," I told her. "That's the part they never tell you. Because here is the truth I learned too late, but lived long enough to carry. What was done to you is part of your story, but it is not the author. You can be hurt and still be whole. You can lose years and still build a life. You can walk out of darkness and become the light for someone else. Bamberg is still there. So is the past. But so am I, and I am not the girl on the porch anymore.